Moscow says it is now reviewing fresh U.S. peace proposals on Ukraine, and that a top aide to President Vladimir Putin has already spoken directly with members of the U.S. administration. After years of war and failed stop-start diplomacy, the Kremlin is signaling something important tonight. The channel is open, the documents are in hand, and the next decisions could shape what the battlefield looks like in the weeks ahead. Here is what we know and what we do not. The Kremlin says Putin's foreign policy aide, Yuri Ushakov, spoke by telephone with several members of President Donald Trump's administration after Moscow received U.S. proposals for a possible peace deal. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov would not say when the call happened. He also refused to discuss what the proposals contain, arguing that public commentary could damage the negotiations. But he did confirm the basic direction. The proposals were analyzed in Moscow, contact took place on Putin's behalf, and both sides agreed to continue dialogue. And the way those proposals reportedly arrived is itself revealing. The Kremlin says Putin's envoy, Kirill Dmitriev, returned to Moscow with paper copies of the U.S. proposals after meetings in Miami. Those contacts and the choice to move physical documents rather than rely only on statements and messages suggests a process that is becoming more structured, even if it remains secret. It also suggests both sides are trying to keep control of the narrative and the details, limiting leaks, limiting public commitments, and leaving room to walk away if the politics or the battlefield shifts. So what might be inside those papers? Officials are not saying. So we have to be careful here. But multiple public reports point to a framework that touches the same pressure points that have blocked every previous attempt. Where the lines stop, what happens to occupied territory, what security guarantees Ukraine gets, and how any ceasefire would be monitored and enforced. The most sensitive issues are not technical at all. They are political and existential for both Kiev and Moscow. Who controls which land? Who gets to claim victory? And what prevents a pause from becoming just another reset before the next offensive? Now place this Kremlin update alongside what Kiev is saying. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has said he will meet President Trump in Florida, with territorial questions and the fate of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant among the key topics. Zelensky has also said drafts for a peace framework and a U.S.-Ukraine security guarantee agreement are close to completion, while acknowledging that the hardest questions remain unresolved. The White House in these reports did not immediately confirm his claims, but the planned meeting underscores how fast this track is moving right now. And here is the reality that sits under all of it. Negotiations are happening while missiles are still flying and while ground fighting continues. Even as diplomacy accelerates, neither side has declared that it is ready to stop shooting. That matters because it shapes leverage. If one side believes time is on its side militarily, it has less incentive to compromise at the table. If one side believes it is approaching a limit in manpower, ammunition, or public tolerance, it may push harder for a deal, even a painful one. Zelensky has framed the territorial question as the core stumbling block. Ukraine has consistently said it will not recognize Russian control over occupied areas, and it will not simply hand over territory it still holds. At the same time, the U.S. and Ukraine appear to be discussing ways to package any future settlement around enforcement mechanisms and guarantees, precisely because earlier political promises did not stop Russia from escalating again. And there is a second, less visible layer: economic recovery, reconstruction, and how Ukraine's post-war prosperity would be financed and protected. Now, watch the Kremlin's language closely. Peskov emphasized analysis, contact, and continued dialogue, while refusing to validate or reject the proposals publicly. That is a classic negotiating posture. It keeps Moscow from appearing cornered. It avoids signaling concession. It also allows Russia to test U.S. seriousness without committing itself. If a deal collapses, the Kremlin can argue it never promised anything. If a deal advances, it can claim it drove the outcome on its own terms. At the same time, Russian media reporting is feeding expectations that Moscow may be looking for a price it can sell at home. Reuters cited reporting from the Russian newspaper Kommersant that Putin told some top Russian businessmen he might be open to swapping some territory controlled by Russian forces. but that he wants the whole of the Donbas. The Kremlin, asked about it, said peace discussions were touched on generally at that meeting, without confirming the details. Still, the reporting highlights the central problem. Any idea of a land swap sounds flexible in theory, but becomes explosive when you define what is being swapped and what is being demanded in return. Because in practice, Donbas is not a single bargaining chip. It is cities, towns, and people. It is decades of identity politics, language politics, and competing historical narratives. It is also a strategic corridor. Whoever holds it shapes supply routes, industrial capacity, and the defensive depth of Ukraine's east. Moscow has long described control over Donetsk and Luhansk as non-negotiable. Kiev has described its sovereignty over those same regions as non-negotiable. That is why every draft plan eventually runs into a wall. So when you hear the word proposals, think less of one clean peace treaty and more of a package of conditional steps. A ceasefire line potentially tied to verification, a staged process for prisoners, humanitarian access, and civilian return. A timeline for sanctions and trade rules, whether tightened or loosened depending on compliance. Some form of monitoring, possibly involving third parties. And the hardest part, security guarantees for Ukraine that are meaningful enough to deter a future attack while being politically acceptable to the countries asked to provide them. That security question is where many talks fail. Zelensky has made clear he wants guarantees strong enough to prevent a repeat of earlier arrangements that did not hold. But guarantees are expensive. They involve commitments of forces, money, intelligence, air defense, and long-term training. They also risk escalation if they are framed as a pathway into military alliances that Moscow opposes. That is why negotiators end up arguing over the meaning of words like guarantee, assurance, or partnership, and over who is actually bound to act if Russia violates a deal. Then there is the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, Europe's largest. It sits near the front line, it has been under Russian control, and it has been a recurring source of international alarm. Ukraine has said safe operation requires demilitarization of the area and full access for Ukrainian staff. Reports say discussions have explored some form of joint access involving the U.S., Ukraine, and Russia, but details remain unresolved. Any arrangement there would be both symbolic and practical, because control of the plant is also control of energy, stability, and a powerful negotiating lever. Now step back and ask the obvious question. Why now? Part of the answer is political calendar and fatigue. The war has dragged on for years with immense costs in lives, infrastructure, and global economic disruption. Governments face domestic pressure about spending, about energy markets, about refugee flows, about food supply shocks, and about the risk that the conflict widens. A negotiation track can be used to reduce those risks, even if it does not produce a final settlement quickly. Another part of the answer is leverage. Diplomacy often accelerates when both sides think they can improve their position, either by continued fighting or by locking in gains before the situation changes. If Moscow believes it can formalize control over territory it holds, it may engage. Of Kiev Bolivas at Secure Bunding Si Populus at Economy at Man Gaja, of Washington Bolivas at Canada Mojoa at Lust Fraser at Tums that limit future stability at Wopsied. None of that munstigsad a class. It means the incentives to test a deal are rising. And there is a third element, the wider international coalition. European governments have their own red lines and their own interests, from sanctions policy to long-term security architecture. Russia, for its part, has criticized European and Ukrainian efforts to amend U.S. proposals, according to multiple reports quoting Ushakov. That matters because any durable settlement will likely require coordination across Washington, Kiev, and key European capitals, not just bilateral contacts. Of Europe full sedlunid, of kinsla implementapan, of Russia Bolivas Europe will block consusions at once, of use that is a rosen to stall. Yahan nestall, us as imputinat to vetrad one set of fun. We have seen many moments where diplomacy looked promising only to collapse over sequencing and trust. Who stops first? Who verifies first? Who gives up what first? Ceasefires fail when there is no enforceable mechanism to investigate violations and impose consequences. The full one that zincentavas to chet romanha, The full one is Ledishep and UC said Bolivazat role bepanisha demasta ifa compromise. So what is Kremlin stepmat rula sagan? Avsigniska once Washington the north as takongs proposes seriously enough to ravia them and talk. Avsigns that Moscow wants to cup content privat. And avsigns that Moscow meba posiponang itself to dumb and specific outcomes, especially on to a bufa agrung to ani haltan foot. The pastikamba janyam nogatharang strategy. Avkimba a wa to bayam, dovadelas, and test whiskis other said will makansushins unte prushka. Ans yeales sads of Nedabia. Reports connect their shis to Trump's son Vesteva Whatcuff and Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner. Wethkth the umpered to mut commitments o promuli carrying musijus. The involvement on kuskuras that thus you sees boom drovan from this very open political system, not only through traditional diplomatic chants. That can spud things up, but it can also make negative buns ma posant. And ma vulnerable to abrupt shafts on Ukraina side, Zelenskyra as thrudang a nudla, has saganangas ta ia framwak, well insisting that sovereignty and security cannot be treated away. Ha hazel sung to that of territorial compromises of become berava as sasfadal Ukrainians witsned a darzitsa, including through a referendum of Russia fastugers tosfa a kudang to rupat. That is both a democratic signand, a political shield, because it spreads responsibility for any punfula kamabuyand, president's ulan. But referendums denet solvetskiusha, the mavatha. Yuvanza promisova vat can but interpreted as waknas bahadlanas, as progress by diplomats. And Russiak stedam to shepts environment through military prushka and forpsens divstobat. Manuel Ukrainoans loving ande kukpapa manapal beapatadabat frela. Does it say for qualities that Makavan proceed steps to block contested, and we you live thus pleasure tea, ramamparas happenang at the salon of contact. You've repeated that footing continues fax chinja. Paz up and shaft, infrastructure is destra a, communities omtud. That creates pressure to stop the war, but it also hardens attitudes, making compromise harder. The longer it goes, the more each side frames its sacrifices as proof that it cannot accept less than victory. So what happens next? Vach Varudits, even Putal ones, Yuvtu Sulanskar Muts Trump. Padazatrilla konvechgain, ya mu sama consistent language about sakwansang, about enfasament, and about hamfasang. Second, watch for any additional statements from the Kremlin that go beyond process words like analyze and continue dialogue. If Moscow starts describing principles, not just procedures, that would be a meaningful step. Third, watch whether fighting intensity changes. Sorry as negative ones accompanied Bob Chatampra bidful puzapan. Other yams yasa limited puzzles to bold trust. Atsin pipit with still yes something. Also watch for the question that every diplomat worries about but rarely says out loud. How does a deal survive political change? A ceasefire that depends on one leader's authority can unravel when that leader's incentives change. A settlement that cannot be sold to domestic audiences is unstable, even if it is signed, and an agreement that lacks credible enforcement can become a trap, freezing a conflict without resolving it and setting the stage for the next round. Turlan is nuts canon is rooted to accept a yadas pas plan. Other sangath is rivong proposed this, and if is tikan. Chikurnas nutsangath is rooted to consider turida. Sasanshukut and severantia central and dia central and Titus Dashes Roman and Russellvat. In Washington appears to be pushing an accelerated process, trying to bridge positions that have not moved close enough yet. This is the moment to watch the details, not the headlines. Peace proposals can mean a road to a ceasefire, or they can mean a new phase of bargaining while the war continues. Moscow's revio, and the Ushakov kol confirm this chant is active. But the sprawl test wolba with Kel's nux communications per some mishkab steps. A with sakrasi in this maxim demonsagdi on its sakla of tux with it a grummet factly.